All right, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 7, titled Follow the Oil. Nate laid down his hammer and wiped his sweating brow. He poured himself a cup of water from a bottle, perched on a log, and looked around him. He never imagined Ecuador would be this beautiful. No matter how long I live here, he thought, I will never get tired of the view. To the south, about 40 miles away, stood the snow-covered peak of Mount Sanji, an active volcano. Every morning the mountain seemed different. Some mornings its top glowed red with lava. Other mornings smoke and ash billowed from it, blanketing the land below in grayness. To the east was jungle that stretched farther than the eye could see, all the way across the Amazon basin to the Atlantic Ocean 2,000 miles away. Nate smiled to himself. The house he was building had a living room that faced Mount Sanji. He could just see Marge and himself enjoying a morning cup of coffee as they admired the mountain's snow-capped peak. Nate wondered how Marge was doing in Quito, the capital of Ecuador, high in the Andes Mountains, more than 100 miles to the north. He hoped she was getting plenty of rest. She deserved it. Ever since their wedding, 8 months earlier on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1948, they had been in a whirlwind of activity. First, there had been the meetings with the Mission Aviation Fellowship to make sure they felt called by God to go out as MAF missionaries. Then there were all the meetings to raise money and explain the ministry of MAF. The whole idea of pilots being missionaries was new to many folk in the church. Nate liked to explain that the mission of MAF was not to do what commercial airlines could do more cheaply, but to go where there were no other airlines and where missionaries needed them most. He would say, our responsibility is to harness aviation to the needs of the mission field. Many churches and individuals had understood how useful an air service would be to missionaries and agreed to support Nate and Marge as they established MAF in Ecuador. As soon as Nate had agreed to join MAF, Jim Truxton had set out finding the right location to base the new ministry. He had studied a map of Ecuador. The whole country is about the same size as the state of Nevada. To the west, the country borders the Pacific Ocean. On the coastal lowlands between the ocean and the Andes, bananas were grown for export. Also on the lowlands and all the way up to Quito, located high in the Andes Mountains, in the north-central part of the country, the roads were numerous and in fairly good condition. It was obvious there wasn't a particular need for MAF there. But across the Andes in the eastern part of the country, the roads were scarce and in terrible condition. This part of the country, called the Orient, forms the western edge of the Amazon rainforest. Across the region, missionaries seeking to share the gospel message with the many Indian tribes that inhabited the area lived in stations dotted throughout the jungle. There was a great need for more missionaries in the Orient. The trouble was, it was difficult traveling through the swampy jungles to set up more mission stations. As Jim Truxton looked at his map, he decided this was the area where MAF needed to be working. The ministry would establish a base of operations in the Ecuadorian Orient. Missionaries, however, were not the only Westerners in the Orient. There was another group of people busy making roads and airstrips to support their exploration of the area. This group of people worked for the Shell Oil Company and since 1938 had been exploring the jungle looking for oil. Shell Oil had spent about $40 million developing the roads and airstrips necessary to carry men and supplies in and out of the Orient. It had cost this much because the ground was covered with enormous trees such as balsa, ironwood, and mahogany. Once bulldozers cleared away the trees for a road or airstrip, the problem of the wet soil had to be overcome. Because the Orient received more than 300 inches of rain a year, the ground hardly ever dried out. And because it was so wet, the soil wasn't able to support the weight of a truck or a large aircraft landing. Tons of rock were blasted from the sides of nearby mountains and used to make foundations on the wet soil. On top of these foundations, the road or airstrip could be safely built. It was a long, expensive process, but Shell Oil was certain there were billions of gallons of oil beneath the jungle. All the work would be worth it if they could be the ones to pump the oil out of the ground. Jim Truxton visited Shell Oil's largest airfield and the company's Ecuador headquarters. It was located several miles from the old village of Mera and so was called Shell Mera. There, Jim talked to the chief of operations and explained MAF's goals. He asked if Shell Oil would let an MAF plane use the airstrip. The chief of operations listened carefully and then explained that another plane to help out in an emergency would always be welcome at Shell Mera, but he was worried about safety. If an MAF pilot crashed in the jungle, they would all have to take time out to look for him, and in many cases, planes that crashed in the jungle were never found. Jim Truxton thought for a few moments, and then he made a deal with the chief of operations. MAF would rent an acre of land at the east end of the airfield for $1 a year on the condition that the plane would have a radio on board and the pilot would stay in constant contact with an operator on the ground. That way, if the plane crashed, they would know where to look. So the Missionary Aviation Fellowship followed Shell Oil Company into the Orient, grateful for the hard work and money already spent to prepare the land for oil exploration that would now also be used to bring the gospel message to people who had never heard it. Nate stripped off his shirt and went back to work, thankful that he was not building the new MAF house at Shell Mera alone. Charles Mellis Sr., a 70-year-old builder from St. Louis, had come down to Ecuador to head up the building project. Jim Truxton was also there, as well as several missionaries whom Nate was going to be serving with his plane. Among them was Frank Drown, who would become one of Nate's lifelong friends. Nate glanced across the Stinson aircraft sitting just off the end of the runway. He may not have a house yet, but he did have an airplane. It had been the private plane of the owner of the Weyerhaeuser Company. When the owner heard about the work of Mission Aviation Fellowship, he donated the plane for use in South America. Jim Truxton and Nate had flown it down from the United States. Now it sat on a runway in the jungle of South America, painted yellow, the color of MAF aircraft, and ready for whatever need came along. In fact, Nate had already used the plane for the purpose it had been donated. Frank Drown, who had walked for 7 days across jungle trails to help Nate build the house, mentioned that his family hadn't had any fresh food or medicine for 5 months. When he heard this, Nate took immediate action. As Frank dug foundation holes for the house, Nate flew out to Macuma Base, where Frank and his family were stationed, and dropped a supply of fresh food and a letter from Frank. As he banked around, Nate saw Frank's wife, Marie, waving her thanks for the food. He wished there was some way to ask her if everything was all right and to take a message back to Frank, but there wasn't. There was no radio at Macuma Base and no place nearby to land. As he flew back to Shell Mera, Nate marveled how in just 37 minutes he had covered the same distance that had taken Frank 7 days to walk. The day after the flight to Macuma Station, another family needed Nate's help. The Coopers were missionaries with the Christian and Missionary Alliance and needed transportation back to their jungle home at Dos Rios. Mrs. Cooper much preferred the idea of riding home in an airplane to the way she had ridden out of the jungle. She had come down with a bad case of malaria and needed hospital treatment. The nearest hospital was at Shell Mera, and having no other way to get there, she had been carried all the way by a faithful Indian guide. Now, 3 weeks later, she had recovered enough to be out of the hospital, but it would be months before she could face the walk back to Dos Rios. Nate offered to fly her and her family home, and in just over half an hour, they were back among the Jivaro Indians. News spread quickly among the missionaries of the Orient that Nate Saint and his yellow Stinson airplane were an answer to prayer. After Nate had been building the house at Shell Mera for 3 weeks, he received some wonderful news. Marge was coming to visit. She was 6 months pregnant, and because things had not gone well so far in the pregnancy, she had stayed behind in Quito. She was staying at a guest house run by HCJB, a radio ministry that broadcasted Christian programs around the world. The guest house was minutes away from the most modern hospital in Ecuador. Despite the trouble Marge was having with the pregnancy, her doctor had given her permission to make the bumpy 13-hour journey to visit Nate, as long as she lay down while she traveled. Marge made the trip, lying on a canvas cot in the back of a pickup truck. As she jostled along the winding road from Quito to Shelmera, Nate prayed that she and the baby would be okay. They were. Marge climbed down from the truck, a little wobbly on her legs, but very grateful to have made it in one piece. Finally, she got to be with Nate in Ecuador. They had so much to talk about. During the evenings, they sat around the open fire, their backs to the army tents they slept in, and talked about their future. It was so exciting to be on the mission field, and Marge couldn't wait for the day when their baby would be born and she could move down to Shelmera for good. But for now, they had to make the most of their week together. Marge told Nate everything the doctor had said about how the pregnancy was progressing and all about her Spanish language lessons. Nate eagerly told her about his first local ministry opportunity. He had started a Sunday school for the children of Shelmera. He told Marge how a week after they had begun building the house, 2 little girls from the Shell Oil base came and asked when Sunday school would be starting. It was too good an opportunity to miss, so Nate had immediately said to the girls, "It will be right here in this tent on Sunday morning." When Marge moved to Shelmera for good after the baby was born, she and Nate would have an English-speaking Sunday school to run. Nate also told Marge about the 2 flights he had already made and how he wished he could communicate with the missionaries on the ground. He then went on to tell her about their new neighbors in the jungle. Nate had first heard about them from David Cooper when he'd flown him and his wife and family back to Dos Rios. David had told Nate David had told Nate they were a tribe the local Chicwa Indians called the Aucas. In the Chicwa language, Auca meant savage, and the way David Cooper described them, the Aucas fit their name well. White people had been in the jungles of Ecuador for 3 centuries, and in that time, quite a few had met their death at the end of Auca spears. The first group into the jungle of the Orient were Spanish explorers, then Catholic priests, and later on rubber hunters and gold prospectors. Finally had come oil companies searching for underground deposits of oil. Each group had stories to tell of ambush and terror that made the name Auca the most feared in all the Orient. Members of other Indian tribes in the area knew the boundaries of Auca territory well. The Napo River to the north, the Villano River to the south, the Arajuno River to the west, and the Peruvian border to the east. It was nearly impossible to tempt anyone to cross over into Auca territory. Nate told Marge all he'd heard from other missionaries about how the Aucas lived. They never wore clothes except for a woven string around their waist, like a necklace. No one could be sure where they were at any time because they moved around a lot. They did not seem to have permanent houses or cultivate their land. On the long evenings during Marge's stay at Shelmera, Marge and Nate often prayed for the Aucas, who had never heard the gospel message and wouldn't unless something happened to change the way they welcomed outsiders. Somehow Nate had a feeling his airplane would play a part in reaching them with the gospel. He just didn't yet know how it would all fit together. The day before Marge was due to make the grueling trip back to Quito, she got to see firsthand the value of a pilot and airplane in the jungle. She was hoisting up a GI sheet to Nate, who was standing on the roof joist when an Indian man came running out of the jungle. Out of breath, he handed a note to Marge. A little surprised, she opened it and read the scrawling handwriting. Nancy Cooper sustained a bad gash. Nate and Marge immediately went to work. Marge headed for the Shell Clinic while Nate climbed down from the roof and set about preparing the plane for flight. Half an hour later, he was in the air, headed for the Dos Rios mission station with anti-tetanus serum and bandages aboard the plane. Nate and the yellow MAF Stinson airplane were a blessing to so many people. But as Nate was about to find out, being a blessing could also be very dangerous. A pilot flying a plane over the jungle is never more than a minute away from disaster and death.